Bernie Sanders had always been a passionate advocate for the people. For years, he had been warning about the growing power of the rich and their increasing influence on American politics. This time, though, things were different. He felt that something had to change, that the system was broken in ways that only a few individuals seemed to benefit from. As the world watched, the billionaire class, particularly two individuals, had become symbols of this growing inequality. Elon Musk, the tech mogul, and Donald Trump, the businessman turned president, were at the top of a new oligarchy, a group of powerful elites who controlled vast resources and held immense sway over the political landscape. The country was in a moment of political upheaval. Sanders had been carefully watching as Musk and Trump, despite their different backgrounds, had more in common than people realized. Musk, with his companies like Tesla and SpaceX, was shaping the future of technology and space exploration, while Trump had built an empire of hotels, casinos, and a political career that had shaken the country to its core. Both were incredibly wealthy, both had massive followings, and both used their power to influence the economy and the policies that affected the lives of everyday Americans. But it wasn't just their wealth that concerned Sanders, it was their ability to control and manipulate. Musk had become the face of the tech world, a visionary who had redefined industries. He had an incredible ability to shape the future, yet his vast fortune had come at the expense of workers, some of whom faced grueling conditions at Tesla factories. Meanwhile, Trump's rise to power had been fueled by his wealth and his connections to powerful figures in business and politics. Sanders couldn't ignore how Trump's decisions seemed to benefit the very wealthy while doing little for the millions of working-class Americans who had supported him. As Sanders prepared for his upcoming speech, the country was buzzing with discussion about these two men. People admired Musk for his bold ideas and innovation, while others had long seen Trump as a symbol of success in business. However, to Sanders, they represented something much more dangerous. He saw them as the embodiment of a broken system, one where a few individuals held more power than entire governments, more influence than entire nations. The power they wielded wasn't just financial. It was cultural, political, and even social. These billionaires had a grip on the media, the economy, and policy decisions that affected millions of lives. For Bernie Sanders, it was a wake-up call. It wasn't just about economic inequality anymore. It was about the future of democracy itself. How could ordinary Americans have a say when the voices of the richest few were so loud, so powerful? Musk and Trump didn't just have money. They had the means to shape society in their image. It was time for Sanders to speak out, to remind the nation that this wasn't how things were supposed to work. In the days leading up to the speech, Sanders had gathered his thoughts. He would address not only the power of Musk and Trump, but also the larger implications of their influence. He had seen enough to know that the direction the country was heading wasn't good. The concentration of wealth and power in the hands of a few was leading to greater inequality, more political polarization, and a system that was increasingly failing the average American. It was clear that things had to change, but Sanders knew that to make people listen, he had to use his platform and make his message clear. He had spent years advocating for the many, and now, more than ever, he felt it was his responsibility to take a stand against the oligarchy that seemed to control so much of the country's future. With the nation's eyes on him, Sanders prepared for the challenge. He understood the power of words and knew this speech could make waves. It wasn't just a critique of Musk and Trump. It was a call to action, a plea for people to see the bigger picture. The speech wasn't just about pointing fingers. It was about waking up the American people to the truth. This would be more than a speech. It would be a declaration of war against an oligarchy that threatened the very fabric of American democracy. As the moment approached, Sanders steeled himself, determined to deliver his message with clarity and conviction. The time had come for him to speak the truth, and he would not hold back. As Bernie Sanders stepped onto the stage, the energy in the room was electric. The crowd was eager, hanging on to every word he said. Sanders had always been known for his strong speeches, but this time, There was something different in the air. He wasn't just going to speak about politics or policies. This speech was going to be about something much bigger: the growing influence of billionaires and the system they had built to protect their wealth. For years, Sanders had been warning about the increasing concentration of wealth in the hands of a few individuals. He had watched as powerful figures like Elon Musk and Donald Trump seemed to gain more control over not just the economy, but the very way people lived their lives. These men, who had once been business figures in their own right, were now larger-than-life icons. They were shaping the future, setting trends, and influencing policy decisions that affected everyone, from factory workers to teachers to healthcare professionals. Sanders knew that if things kept going in this direction, it could mean the end of fair opportunities for most Americans. The rising power of billionaires wasn't just about their money. It was about how they were able to use that money to control and shape society. Musk, with his groundbreaking tech companies like Tesla and SpaceX, was often portrayed as a visionary, a genius who could change the world. But Sanders wasn't so sure. He couldn't ignore the fact that Musk's companies, despite their success, were built on the backs of workers who often faced harsh conditions and long hours. People were struggling to make ends meet while Musk was reaching for the stars. To Sanders, this wasn't the model of a fair and just society. It was a system where the few got richer while the many suffered. And then there was Donald Trump, a man who had built an empire on real estate, television, and politics. Trump's ability to leverage his wealth and his influence in both business and government was something that couldn't be ignored. He had gone from a businessman to the President of the United States, using his position of power to push policies that seemed to benefit the rich, leaving the working-class Americans who had supported him with little more than empty promises. Trump's wealth and influence allowed him to change laws, shape economic policies, and even sway elections. To Sanders, this was a dangerous precedent. What bothered Sanders the most wasn't just how Musk and Trump had achieved their success. It was how they used their power. These men didn't just run businesses or make products. They controlled entire industries. They had the resources to influence laws, create monopolies, and shape the economy in a way that suited their needs, regardless of the consequences for the average person. The influence they wielded was far-reaching, from the tech world to politics to the media. Sanders knew that something had to be done before their control over the country grew even stronger. The problem wasn't just Musk or Trump individually. It was the system that allowed them to rise to such power. The economic and political system had become so rigged in favor of the rich that it was almost impossible for ordinary people to break through. The wealthy had the means to buy influence, whether through campaign donations, lobbying, or simply by controlling the flow of information. The average American, no matter how hard they worked, had little chance of ever achieving the same level of power. This wasn't just a matter of unfair wealth distribution. It was a matter of democracy itself. How could a democracy function when a few billionaires controlled so much? As Sanders stood before the crowd, he knew he had a responsibility to speak out. He wasn't going to sugarcoat things or shy away from the truth. He had spent his entire career fighting for the little guy, the workers, the middle class, the poor. And now was the time to draw a line in the sand. He had seen the damage that unchecked wealth and power could do to a nation, and he wasn't going to let it continue without a fight. The speech was more than just a criticism of Musk and Trump. It was a warning. Sanders wanted to show the American people that the way things were going wasn't sustainable. He wanted them to understand that if they didn't take action, if they didn't demand change, the future of the country could be at risk. The rich and powerful had too much influence, and unless people stood up and fought for a fairer system, it could soon be too late to fix things. Sanders wasn't the type to back down, and he wasn't going to let the system keep pushing the same old narrative. He was ready to make his case, to challenge the status quo, and to fight for a future where everyone, regardless of their wealth or status, had a fair shot at success. The time had come for the people to take back control. As Bernie Sanders began his speech, the room fell silent in anticipation. He knew this moment was bigger than any other speech he had given before. The crowd was filled with people who had followed his career, who believed in his message of fairness and equality. They were there because they knew that Sanders wasn't just another politician. He was someone who fought for the common person, someone who stood up against the powerful elites who seemed to get richer while the rest of the country struggled. He took a deep breath before speaking, and his first words rang out clearly across the room. The wealth of this country is in the hands of a few, while so many of us are left behind. With those simple words, he started to paint a picture of the growing divide in America. He didn't need fancy statistics or complex arguments. He just needed to speak the truth. The wealth gap was widening, and the rich were getting richer while the average American worked harder just to make ends meet. Sanders knew that the real problem was the way the system was built to protect the interests of the wealthy. It wasn't just that Musk and Trump were billionaires. It was that they represented a system that allowed such concentration of wealth and power to exist in the first place. Musk had become one of the richest men in the world, and many saw him as a symbol of innovation and progress. But Sanders wasn't buying into that narrative. He acknowledged Musk's successes, but made it clear that the way Musk had built his empire was not the way things should work in a fair society. Sanders pointed out that while Musk talked about creating a new future, one where humanity could colonize Mars, he was ignoring the struggles of the people living on Earth. Tesla workers, Sanders said, were working long hours in difficult conditions, and some were not being treated with the respect they deserved. Meanwhile, Musk's wealth continued to soar. For Sanders, this was a perfect example of how the ultra-wealthy had created a system where they could get richer and richer while ordinary workers were left to deal with the consequences. And then, Sanders turned his attention to Donald Trump, a man whose very name had become synonymous with wealth and power. Trump had used his fortune to rise to the highest office in the land, and many believed his wealth gave him the right to influence decisions that affected millions of lives. Sanders didn't shy away from confronting Trump's methods. He spoke about Trump's time as president, when his policies seemed to benefit the wealthiest Americans, while leaving many struggling families behind. Trump's tax cuts for the rich and his deregulation efforts were just a few examples of how the system worked in favor of billionaires and against the average American worker. To Sanders, this was the heart of the issue. The system was set up in a way that made it easy for people like Musk and Trump to succeed, while those at the bottom had to fight for every scrap. It wasn't just that they were wealthy. It was that their wealth and power allowed them to control the political system, the economy, and even the media. The rich had become so powerful that they could push through laws that benefited themselves, and ordinary people were left with little to no say in the matter. As Sanders spoke, his voice grew more passionate. He wasn't just criticizing Musk and Trump. He was making a call for change. "We cannot continue down this path," he said. "We cannot let the few control everything while the many are left behind." He talked about the need for a system that worked for everyone, not just the rich and powerful. Sanders made it clear that he wasn't against wealth or success, but he was against a system that allowed such concentration of power to exist. He believed that everyone should have an equal chance to succeed, and that the government should work for the people, not for the billionaires who controlled it behind the scenes. The room was silent as Sanders finished his remarks about Musk and Trump. People were listening intently, absorbing every word. Sanders knew that he was making an important point, one that needed to be heard across the country. He was challenging the very foundations of the system, calling on people to reject the idea that the rich should have more power than anyone else. He wasn't just speaking about the problems of the wealthy elite. He was speaking about a vision for a different kind of future, one where people's voices mattered, where the rich didn't control everything. This speech was about more than just criticizing individuals. It was about changing the system so that it worked for everyone, not just the powerful few. And as Sanders continued to speak, he could feel the energy in the room building. The people were with him. They knew that this fight was one that was worth having. As Bernie Sanders continued his speech, he focused more intently on Elon Musk, turning his attention to the impact of Musk's companies on the lives of ordinary people. Sanders spoke with conviction about Musk's ability to shape industries and influence public opinion, but he wasn't fooled by the glossy image of a self-made billionaire innovator. Musk was often celebrated for his bold ideas: Tesla's electric cars, SpaceX's space missions, and even the futuristic dreams of colonizing Mars. But Sanders made it clear that there was another side to the story. He pointed out that while Musk's companies were often praised for their innovation, they were built on the backs of workers who faced harsh conditions in the factories. Sanders didn't just mention the success stories. He brought attention to the struggles of the people who made those successes possible. Tesla, he argued, was a prime example of the way in which billionaires were able to profit from their wealth, while workers were left with little to show for their hard work. He spoke about the long hours many workers spent assembling cars in factories, facing high-pressure expectations, and dealing with dangerous working conditions. Sanders didn't hesitate to remind the crowd that while Musk was sending rockets to space and making headlines with his latest ventures, many of his employees were still fighting for better wages and working conditions. Musk's wealth, Sanders explained, didn't just come from innovation and technological breakthroughs. It came from a system that allowed Musk to grow richer and more powerful, while others continued to struggle. He emphasized that Musk's business model relied on paying workers as little as possible, despite their vital contributions to his success. In this way, Musk was no different from other wealthy elites who reaped the rewards of a system that benefited them and left the rest behind. Sanders didn't stop there. He also spoke about Musk's influence on the broader economy and his role in shaping public discourse. Musk wasn't just a businessman. He was a cultural force, a figure who used his massive wealth and social media presence to sway public opinion. Sanders reminded the audience how Musk had a way of making headlines almost every day. Whether it was about Tesla's stock prices, new innovations, or his personal tweets, Sanders questioned whether such a person should have so much control over the public's attention, or whether it was right for someone with so much wealth to be able to shape conversations in ways that benefited his own business interests. But it wasn't just Musk's business practices that concerned Sanders. It was the broader system that allowed Musk to become such a powerful figure in the first place. Sanders argued that the system was rigged in favor of the wealthy, allowing them to rise to positions of power where they could dictate the direction of industries, push for policies that favored them, and ultimately control the narrative. The more money someone had, the more power they gained to shape the world around them, regardless of how it impacted the lives of regular people. At this point in the speech, Sanders turned to the heart of his argument: the fact that wealth shouldn't be able to buy influence. He argued that a functioning democracy could not exist when a small group of individuals held so much power, especially when their wealth gave them the ability to control everything from the media to the economy. It wasn't just about one billionaire or another. It was about the larger picture of what it meant to live in a society where the rich had more say in decisions than the people who were actually impacted by those decisions. Musk, Sanders made clear, was a symbol of this larger issue: the problem of an economy and a political system that allowed the wealthy to manipulate the system to their advantage. Sanders called for change, urging the crowd to recognize the dangerous trend of growing wealth inequality. He argued that if people didn't stand up to the power of billionaires like Musk, the consequences would be even more severe. The rich and powerful, he warned, were working to keep the system rigged in their favor. But it didn't have to be that way. Sanders believed in the power of the people to create a fairer system, one where workers were treated with dignity, where the rich couldn't dominate the economy, and where everyone had the chance to succeed, not just the few at the top. The crowd responded with applause, and Sanders could feel the energy in the room. His words had struck a chord. This wasn't just a speech. It was a call to action. Sanders wasn't backing down from the challenge. He was going to continue to speak out against the system and the billionaires who had too much control. He would fight for a future where the voices of ordinary people could be heard, and where the wealthy didn't have the power to determine the fate of the country. As Bernie Sanders continued his speech, he noticed the crowd was deeply engaged, hanging on every word he said. The powerful truths he was speaking resonated with the people who had gathered to hear him. They were tired of watching the rich get richer while the rest of the country struggled to get by. Sanders could feel the tension in the room, a shared frustration with a system that seemed to benefit only a few, leaving the majority of Americans behind. He didn't just focus on Elon Musk and Donald Trump anymore. He broadened his argument to show how their power was part of a much larger issue. It wasn't just about two wealthy individuals. It was about the system they represented. Sanders called this system an oligarchy because it was controlled by a small group of powerful elites, people who had the resources and influence to shape society in their favor. These elites, Sanders argued, didn't just want wealth, they wanted control. They wanted to decide the rules, to influence politics, to set the course of the economy in ways that would guarantee their own success. Sanders painted a picture of the everyday American who worked hard, played by the rules, but still couldn't get ahead. He spoke about the struggles of people working multiple jobs just to make ends meet, about teachers who were underpaid, about healthcare workers who had to fight for proper wages and benefits. Meanwhile, the billionaires at the top continued to profit, their wealth growing by the day. It wasn't just about the rich getting richer. It was about how this wealth disparity was creating a divide that could tear the country apart. The rich had so much power that they could shape laws, influence elections, and push policies that served their own interests, often at the expense of everyone else. Sanders' tone grew more serious as he explained how the concentration of wealth wasn't just unfair, it was dangerous. He warned that when so much power is held by such a small group, democracy itself was at risk. The voices of the people were being drowned out by the wealth and influence of the few. It was no longer about what was best for the country. It was about what was best for the people who had the most money. And that, Sanders argued, was a direct threat to the very foundation of America. He reminded the crowd of the founding ideals of the country, how the United States was built on the idea of equality and the belief that everyone should have an opportunity to succeed, regardless of their background. But somewhere along the way, Sanders argued, that dream had been lost. The wealthy had used their resources to create a system that allowed them to thrive, while the rest of the country was left behind. The political system had become corrupt, with money flowing freely from the pockets of billionaires into the campaigns of politicians who served their interests. The government, once designed to represent the people, now seemed to represent only the wealthy elites. Sanders didn't hold back in calling out the political leaders who had allowed this to happen. He spoke about how politicians who were supposed to serve the people had instead sold out to the rich. They passed laws that protected the wealth of the few, while leaving the working class struggling. Sanders made it clear that this wasn't just about a few bad actors. This was about a system that was designed to favor the rich and powerful. It was a system that needed to be changed, and it was up to the people to make that change happen. He also acknowledged that many people felt hopeless. They saw the system as too big to fight, too entrenched to change. But Sanders refused to accept that. He reminded the crowd that change had always come from the people. Throughout history, movements had risen up against injustice, and it was ordinary people, workers, activists, everyday Americans, who had made a difference. Sanders knew that the key to overcoming the oligarchy wasn't just through speeches and protests. It was through a united movement that demanded action, a movement that couldn't be ignored. The time for change is now, Sanders declared, his voice ringing out with passion. We have the power to make this country work for all of us, not just the rich and powerful. He urged the crowd to stand up, to make their voices heard, and to fight for a government that worked for everyone, not just for a select few. Sanders wasn't asking for anything impossible. He was asking for a fairer, more just society, one where the economy worked for everyone and not just the billionaires who controlled it. The crowd erupted in applause, and Sanders felt the energy in the room build. The people were ready for change. They were ready to take on the system that had kept them down for so long. Sanders knew that this fight was far from over, but he believed, more than ever, that it was a fight worth having. He was calling on the American people to rise up. As Bernie Sanders continued to speak, the energy in the room intensified. People were listening intently, nodding along, and some were even on the edge of their seats. It was clear that Sanders had struck a chord. His words had given voice to the frustration that many had been feeling for years. For so long, they had watched the rich and powerful grow even more powerful, while they themselves struggled to make a decent living. It was a feeling of helplessness that many had grown used to, but Sanders was offering something different: hope. Sanders wasn't just painting a picture of the problem. He was also offering a solution. He made it clear that change wasn't just possible, it was necessary. The system we have right now is broken, Sanders said, his voice strong and unwavering. But we can fix it. We can create a society where everyone has a fair chance to succeed, not just the billionaires who are manipulating the system for their own benefit. He spoke about the need for a fair economy, one that wasn't controlled by a few wealthy elites. He outlined how wealth should be distributed more evenly, with a focus on making sure that people who worked hard had a decent wage and good benefits. Sanders didn't believe in trickle-down economics, where the rich would somehow spread their wealth to the rest of the country. He knew that real change came from making sure the system worked for the people, not for the corporations and billionaires at the top. Healthcare, education, housing. These are not privileges, Sanders declared. They are basic human rights. He emphasized the importance of a society that took care of its people, a society that didn't force families to go into debt just to see a doctor or send their children to college. Sanders spoke passionately about the need for universal health care, free public college education, and affordable housing for all. These were the things that could truly level the playing field and give everyone, no matter their background, a fair shot at success. The crowd responded positively, with people clapping and cheering. They were hearing Sanders' message loud and clear. This wasn't just about making small improvements. It was about transforming the country, creating a society where everyone's needs were taken seriously. The idea of free healthcare, for instance, was something that many Americans longed for but felt was impossible. Yet Sanders made it seem possible, with a clear plan that could take the country in a new direction. But Sanders wasn't naive. He knew that the road ahead would be tough. He acknowledged that the rich and powerful would fight against any efforts to change the system. They had too much to lose. For years, they had created a system that benefited them, and they weren't going to give it up without a fight. But Sanders wasn't discouraged. He believed that the American people could rise to the challenge. "We've seen it before," Sanders reminded the crowd. "When ordinary people come together, when we stand united, we can change the world." He cited historical examples of social movements, workers fighting for better wages, women fighting for the right to vote, and civil rights activists pushing for equality. These were all moments in history where ordinary people had fought back against powerful interests and won. Sanders knew that the same kind of movement was needed now, and he was confident that the people were ready for it. As he continued, Sanders made it clear that the key to changing the system was getting people involved. It wasn't enough just to complain about the way things were. It was time to act. "We need to demand a better future," he said. "We need to fight for policies that help working people and bring real change to this country." His words were inspiring, and the crowd's energy was palpable. The idea of being part of a movement that could bring real change to the country was something that resonated deeply with the people in the room. Sanders knew that this was the moment to ignite the fire of activism, to get people motivated and ready to fight for their rights. He spoke about the power of voting, stressing that elections were a way to send a message to the politicians who served the wealthy. If enough people turned out to vote, if enough people fought for the policies that would benefit everyone, change was possible. Sanders emphasized the importance of standing together and making sure that the voices of everyday people were heard. By the time he finished his speech, the room was filled with applause and cheers. People were energized, ready to take on the challenges that lay ahead. Sanders had shown them that they weren't powerless in the face of the wealthy elites. He had reminded them that they had the power to demand change, and together, they could build a society that worked for everyone. It wasn't going to be easy, but with people like Sanders leading the charge, the future felt a little bit brighter. As Bernie Sanders continued to speak, the energy in the room was electric. People were feeling a renewed sense of hope, and the message he was delivering had a powerful impact. Sanders wasn't just talking about policy. He was talking about the future of the country. His words were a call to action, urging the audience to recognize the power they held and how, together, they could create meaningful change. Sanders looked around at the crowd, knowing that his words were reaching the hearts of those who were tired of the status quo. It wasn't just the frustration with billionaires like Elon Musk and Donald Trump that brought them here. It was the deeper understanding that the system itself was flawed. The concentration of wealth and power in the hands of a few had shaped the very structure of the country. Sanders knew that this wasn't just a problem of individuals. It was a problem of a broken system, one that needed to be dismantled and rebuilt in a way that served the many, not just the few. He spoke about the importance of fighting for a fair economy, one that worked for everyone. Sanders painted a picture of a society where health care, education, and housing weren't privileges reserved for the wealthy, but basic rights for all citizens. He understood that many in the room had experienced the difficulty of accessing quality health care or paying for college education. He spoke about the staggering cost of prescription drugs, the burdensome student loan debt, and the overwhelming financial strain that families faced. Yet, in the face of these challenges, Sanders remained optimistic. "We have the power to change this," Sanders said, his voice filled with confidence. "It's not too late. It's never too late to fight for what's right." He reminded the crowd that this wasn't an impossible task. The fight for fairness had always been difficult, but it had always been worth it. He pointed to the history of the labor movement, the civil rights movement, and the fight for women's suffrage as examples of how change could happen when people stood together and refused to accept the injustices they faced. The road ahead would be tough, Sanders knew, but the rewards would be worth it. Sanders also acknowledged the challenges ahead. He spoke about the powerful political donors who would fight to maintain the system as it was. The billionaires, the corporations, and the politicians who supported them had a lot to lose if the country moved toward a more equitable future. They would do everything in their power to resist change. But Sanders was undeterred. He believed that the American people were stronger than any obstacle they faced. The power, Sanders insisted, was in the hands of the people. He called for a movement that would bring together workers, students, healthcare professionals, and everyday Americans who were tired of being left behind. The people who worked long hours to make ends meet, the people who struggled with healthcare costs, the people who couldn't afford to send their children to college. These were the people who had the power to create real change. Sanders knew that this wasn't a fight for him alone. It was a fight for the people, a fight that would take all of them working together to win. Sanders spoke passionately about the need for organizing, how important it was for people to come together and make their voices heard. He reminded the crowd that their power came from their unity. It wasn't about one person or one idea. It was about the collective strength of a group of people who shared a common vision for a better future. Sanders wasn't asking for people to sit back and wait for change to happen. He was asking them to get involved, to stand up, and to demand the changes they wanted to see in their communities, in their country, and in their government. "Your voice matters," Sanders said. "Every vote, every protest, every call to your elected officials, it all counts. Together, we can push for policies that make a real difference in people's lives. Together, we can create a country that works for everyone." The crowd erupted in applause, and Sanders could feel the energy of the room building. The people were with him. They were ready to take action. Sanders knew that this was only the beginning, but the fire of hope and determination had been lit. The message was clear. If they were going to build a better future, they had to do it together. And it was a future that could be achieved, one step at a time. Sanders' words carried a sense of urgency, but also a sense of hope. He didn't sugarcoat the difficulties they would face. but he reminded the crowd that they had the power to overcome them. The fight for a fairer, more just society wasn't just a dream. It was a fight worth fighting, and they were the ones who could make it happen. As Bernie Sanders concluded his speech, the energy in the room reached a peak. People were no longer just listening. They were motivated. The message had resonated deeply with them, and it was clear that Sanders had ignited a fire that wouldn't easily be put out. There was something powerful about the idea that they, the everyday people, could come together and create change. They weren't powerless in the face of the billionaires and corporations who controlled the system. They had a voice, and that voice mattered. Sanders looked around, feeling the weight of the moment. This wasn't just another rally or speech. It was the beginning of something much bigger. The crowd was fired up, ready to take the message of fairness and justice to the streets, to their neighborhoods, to their workplaces, and to their families. Sanders understood that change wasn't going to happen overnight. It was going to take hard work, determination, and persistence. But he also knew that the first step had been taken. The people had heard the call, and they were ready to answer. He reminded them that the fight wasn't just about the policies. It was about the values that those policies represented. It wasn't just about healthcare reform, or raising the minimum wage, or making education more affordable. It was about creating a society where everyone had the chance to succeed, not just the wealthy. It was about fairness, equality, and justice for all. And that, Sanders argued, was a cause worth fighting for. We can't afford to sit back and wait for change, Sanders said, his voice firm. The time to act is now. If we're going to create a future where everyone has the opportunity to live a decent life, where workers are respected and paid fairly, where health care is a right, not a privilege, then we have to stand together and demand it. The crowd cheered in agreement, knowing that Sanders was right. They couldn't wait for someone else to fix the system. They had to be the ones to do it. Sanders had laid out the vision for a better future, but it was up to them to make that vision a reality. It wasn't just about voting every few years. It was about staying engaged, staying active, and demanding accountability from the politicians and corporations that had too much power. Sanders spoke about the importance of continuing to build a movement that could push for the changes they needed. He knew that they would face resistance. There would be those who would try to stop them, those who would use their wealth and influence to hold on to their power. But Sanders was unwavering. He believed in the strength of the people, in their ability to fight for what was right, and in their determination to create a better future for themselves and for the generations to come. We have the power to change the future, Sanders declared, but only if we are willing to fight for it. If we stay united, if we stand together, we can make this country work for all of us, not just the few at the top. The applause was deafening. It was clear that the crowd was ready to fight. They were ready to take on the powerful elites who had controlled the system for so long. Sanders had given them the courage to believe that change was possible, and that together, they could make a real difference. The vision of a fairer, more just society was within reach, but it would require their collective effort to bring it to life. As the rally came to a close, Sanders left the stage with a sense of accomplishment. He had done what he came to do. He had sparked something in the crowd. It was no longer just his fight. It was their fight too. The battle for a better future was far from over, but the people were ready. They were ready to stand up, to push for change, and to hold the powerful accountable. And so, as Sanders walked off the stage, he knew that the movement had begun. The people were no longer just bystanders. They were the driving force behind the change that was to come. The fight for justice, for fairness, and for equality had just begun, and with every person who joined the cause, the movement grew stronger. It was no longer a dream. It was a reality in the making. And as long as they stayed united and kept fighting, the future would be theirs to shape. Sanders had planted the seed, and now it was up to the people to nurture it, to grow it, and to carry it forward. The road ahead would be long, but with each step they took together, they would get closer to the country they had always hoped for, a country where everyone had the opportunity to succeed, where wealth and power were shared, and where justice and fairness were the guiding principles. The movement was just beginning, and the future was theirs to create.